Assalamualaikum and good morning, everyone. Okay. I have to thank Mr. Daniel Farah as well as Moritz because they've taken words from my mouth. And I think my presentation can be as short as 5 minutes. Okay, joke aside. There'll be 2-course meal that we're going to serve you from the Labuan team. My briefing will be the appetizer session to provide you an overview, a broad picture of why the changes are necessary in terms of the Labuan leasing, and also to bring you an appreciation of where the global market for leasing itself. Then from there on, my colleague will take through in terms of the meat of the session in a way, in terms of what changes this Labuan leasing has taken place since December when we issued the guidelines, but also what does it have in terms of translating it to operations, to the market and the players per se. All right. So I'll start with a bit of overview, a 101 on the market, and from there on we'll get into some of the key developments that brings about the rationale of why we changed the guidelines on leasing. Right. This might be of a knowledge to all of you, but I don't think all of you is actually quite aware of where the global leasing is all about. So we heard about the figure 1.1 trillion being mentioned many times from the last speakers, the three last individuals who have been giving you opening remarks. But you know that it's actually grown double since 2010. So the rapid growth has actually shown average growth of about 11% each year to reach the 1.1 trillion in 2016. So if we were to actually project and protract 2018, I could safely say that mathematically it will reach even 2 trillion. That's an impressive number. In terms of the drivers, I think it's no-brainer. You can see the North American and European players are there. The US is actually the main player with its equipment and commercial vehicles. The Europeans are with the UK and Germany, markets which drives leasing. But again, UK and Germany is number 3 and number 4. So you might ask, who is number 2? Not surprisingly, or surprisingly, China is actually number 2 in terms of the second largest leasing market in the world. And that says a lot in terms of what prospects Asia has. Next comes Japan and Korea. These are the key drivers of the Asian market for leasing, and also Taiwan. So you might ask, where is Malaysia? Well, Malaysia is 40th. Not bad because it's 40th from 50 countries which were top in terms of the leasing volume. And in fact, we even rank higher than Hong Kong, who is ranked 45. And Singapore was not even in the listing. So that says a lot in terms of what Malaysia has achieved in the last 10 years in terms of leasing and where it can go going forward. I wouldn't have to mention the other 3 regions because they just garner 5% of the market, so it's not worth it to really talk about it. Yeah? So again, as mentioned, Asian is actually the booming engine. Okay, in terms of the underlying markets, to see what drives global leasing, it's worthwhile to look into the balance sheets of the industry. So there are 2 types of groups of asset leases. The shorter term leases looks into more commercial driven kind of assets being leased out like equipments, machinery on a small scale basis, fleet vehicles, commercials and automobiles. But what's more interesting is actually the second grouping where it looks into the large and specialized assets, the longer tail lease, which looks into the specialized equipments, ships, vessels and aircrafts. And that will be the focus of our session. In fact, if you look into this particular grouping, you can easily say that the underlying market is actually oil and gas. That's the predominant market. We'll touch about it in the next slide. And also the aerospace industry, aviation. The fact remains that at the moment, when you look through in terms of value, in terms of prevalence, oil and gas industry actually drives all activities, including leasing market. So when we try to actually project or more or less superimpose the growth between the global oil and gas revenue as vis-a-vis the global leasing volume, quite interesting to see there's actually high correlation. And looking at the fact here, we have the growth 2014-15, 6.4%. Prior to that, it was 7%. And the dip in the oil and gas actually influences that U curve. And in fact, when the 2015, that was the time when the oil price per barrel that actually goes low as deep as low as 30 USD per barrel. that's where you can see also that it's turning point. And when there's an improvement from 15 and 16, we also see the same kind of growth in the leasing. So likewise, the pattern is the same for the Labuan leasing trend. You have seen that it was mentioned many times, actually we have about 48 or 49 billion as 2017. But initially, when we look through from the last 4 years, there's a bit of a kink in 15 and 16. And that also correlates with the oil and gas. But interestingly, we see a 1-year lag. So if you were to actually protract look at the left diagram, where there is actually going to be an increase in 2017, so you would expect that kind of growth would actually seep through the Labuan leasing in this year. So we should see a boost from 2017 to 2018, inshallah. So the fact remains that oil and gas is the key driver. Although this is good, but as they say, when you put all your eggs into one basket, there'll be concentration risk. So there needs to be a way in which global market as well as Labuan leasing itself to get into another alternative source of growth. And this is where I'll be touching about. In the next few slides, I'll talk about 4 drivers in the development of leasing market. 2 of them is actually going to be globally driven and affects all countries. 2 will be more closer to heart in terms of our Malaysian, the way Malaysia is actually trying to organize itself economically, as well as where Labuan is going to be playing a role to do more and to transform to a bigger role basically, and how this actually affects the Labuan leasing market. Okay, so lots of mentioning about aviation as one of those engine of growth over the last, for the next 20 years basically. In fact, the last 3 years shown a rapid growth in aviation. Some of the reports that shows that in 20 years time, 2036, there'll be a doubling of the fleet of airplanes that are being demanded across the world. And again, not surprisingly, Asia Pacific is seen to be the source of this growth. And there'll be a tripling from 6,000 to nearly 18,000 fleet demands for vehicle. And all this would of course translate to demand for leasing. In terms of air traffic, I'm quoting one of the reports by MIDA, it was shown that there will be, in Asia alone, there'll be 2.7 billion worth of demands for air travels. And from ASEAN alone, it will be about 500 million. That's a lot figure. Air traffic expected from the Asia is actually going to be about 6.7% growth per annum over the next 20 years. And that exceeds even the global growth rate of air travels of nearly 5%. So that speaks a lot about Asia. In terms of the global leasing, we have mentioned there about some of the key top players in the aviation space. And 6 of them is actually registered within Labuan IBFC. And that's something worth mentioning. And in terms of the proportion, it's still quite, I would say, moderate, only 1/3 of the market, whereas the majority is still will be with the oil and gas on 60%. So there's room to play in which we can see that if leasing can actually become the next driver, we can even have a 50-50 portfolio between leasing for aircraft as well as oil and gas. And that's one of our aim as well. Okay, many times have been mentioned about this OECD, what was it, the word used by Mr. Daniel? Creature. Right, it's the standard setting body for the economic policies around the world, particularly fiscal policies. And their main aim is actually to make sure that their growth is actually on a sustainable basis from one jurisdiction to the other. And one of the recent initiatives that they have is actually on the base erosion and profit shifting, or what we call as BEPS. This is the definition of BEPS in terms of what they're trying to address. But as the name mentioned, the layman term for it is that they're trying to prevent for undue flows between one country which has higher taxes into jurisdiction with lower or more competitive tax regimes. So that's basically it. But saying that, they're not going to undermine either preferential tax regimes in any country. But what they are looking for, if harmful practices are being conducted, that brings about that flow, and that is what they are frowning upon. And in terms of the parameters that they use, there are several, there are actually 4, but I'm going to just focus on 3. The acid test that they use, the first is actually about ring fencing. It was mentioned also by our speakers earlier. ring fencing here means that there's actually no there's actually separation between the regime and the domestic tax regime, and so there'll be some barriers in terms of how certain groups of people within the domestic economy from accessing the same tax incentives. Second part relates to the substantial activities. This is actually meaning that there's supposed to be some commercial presence and rooted presence within the regime that provides the tax incentive. And the last but not least, on transparency, one of the sub-features is actually that all these rules are actually clear in terms of people would like to apply for the tax incentive. Secondly, is also looking into whether the regime practices sufficient monitoring as well as regulation and supervising when giving out the incentives. So how does it translate to Labuan? Well, as mentioned, Malaysia was actually assessed, 13 regimes altogether, and 2 of them belongs to Labuan. One is leasing and one on gift. For leasing and gift regimes, it was mentioned, it was actually, we were picked out on one element or 2 elements. On the ring fencing factor, it relates to our non-permissibility of dealings in the currency, Malaysian currency, as well as the fact that then we are not also allowed to actually deal, we are supposed to actually require approval only for the local leasings and not subjected to out-out leasing. So those are the 2 things, because it's inequitable between the out-out leasing and the in-out leasing. That was picked out by the OECD. And the other part, which is actually unique for leasing, which OECD also pointed out, is actually there's not enough substantial requirements being enforced. As you know, the old guidelines prior to December 2017, we only require a registered office, and that's it. So that doesn't stand water at the moment, because what they wanted is actually when you have a incentive, a regime that provides incentive, so in this case Labuan IBFC, then there's supposed to be some rooted presence in Labuan Island itself, at least, at the very least. And the forms of it that come, I'll talk about it later. Yeah. Okay. Mr. Leader talked about the transformation of Labuan. So in some of our dialogues that we have with the government, with the Ministry of Finance, with Bank Negara, IRB, there are some of these key principles that we have obtained in terms of the national economic aspiration, in terms of where we need to have when providing incentives or any tax regime, preferential tax regimes that are given to applicants. So some of this is actually the principles that we ourselves observe. It's not necessarily a law, but it's worthwhile mentioning because it drives the new Labuan regime, so to speak. So one of it is actually on the modernization of the fiscal framework itself. And that was one of the things that we're going to be looking at and review for our transformation of Labuan. As mentioned, it was launched by PM on the 18th of January this year. And within that, we did mention that the framework, the Labuan tax framework needs to be looked at. And some of the features may be archaic. For example, the 20,000 flat option that's given to people when they pay tax, rather than 3% of the profit. That can be seen as a levy rather than tax per se, and it needs to be reviewed whether it makes sense to retain going forward. Second portion relates to substance. Again, this is something that we have heard many times. So substance here relates to how the entities actually gets the commercial presence to operate in those regime. It can be through the physical office. It can be through the manpower that they employ. It could be through the spending that they have. So there's many forms of it. And I believe a lot of these are being translated into the guidelines. And more of this will be explained by Ernie. It is how it means for you to operate as a leasing firm in Labuan IBFC going forward. Another part, an interesting one, but no doubt is a personal take for me when I look through over the series of dialogues that we had with the ministry. Some of the fiscal incentives should not be seen as perpetual or God-given. It should be given in commensurating with the level of maturity of the market. So as long as the market is growing, that's fine, because the impetus that incentives provide would help it to nurture it to expand further. But once it reaches a certain targeted level, then the form of incentive, or even the incentive itself, should be reviewed whether it makes sense. So that's something that we wish to impress upon you, that not to take things for granted in terms of the incentives that we give, but rather opportunize upon it and try to use it for your benefit of your business operations and move on. Yeah. Okay, we talked about Labuan agenda. So this is the transformation plan, a bit of it that I've extracted to give you a sharing of the flavor of it. Yeah. Okay, one of it, the objective is actually to have greater vibrancy and livability in Labuan Island. And two things that Labuan IBFC is doing, Labuan IBFC is doing in terms of promoting or supporting this. One is substance, as I mentioned, establishing the commercial presence within the island. And this is going to be expanding, focusing not just key FIs that we have, key financial institutions like banks and insurers. We're already practicing that, but we're also going beyond entities, and it will not stop at Labuan leasing firms, it will go beyond. Okay, and that is actually one of the focus area that we'll be looking at for this year as well as next year. On the other portion relates to the focus on physical-based activities within the island. As you know, Labuan IBFC thrives on financial regimes, right? But there is actually a role to play where Labuan IBFC supports also by providing, in fact, like banking services or insurance services, and in fact, all the vehicles that are available in the IBFC for the purpose of promoting or inculcating real economic potentials within Labuan Island. And these sectors have been identified. Some of it relates to methanol, downstreaming, aviation, for MRO, aviation as well as shipping, tourism, and medical and health care services. So if you want to know more about this, do read through the Labuan Corporation Labuan Blueprint Development 2030. It should be available in the website. Okay, in terms of how it translates into the key substance requirement across the board for Labuan entities as a whole, as I mentioned, there needs to be maintaining of physical office. There should be core activities being undertaken in the island. The manpower must be sizable enough or commensurating to the business that they have, and of course also the business spending that I mentioned earlier. And all this is supposed to bring you the intended mass, commercial activities, and also the vibrancy and livability of the island. That's the whole intention. So the key takeaways, I know I've talked about many things at the same time, globally and then nationally and locally. So let me just do a summary a bit. Well, the first is that oil and gas sector remains a driver at the moment for leasing. So we need to also be on the lookout into how the oil and gas market is behaving and how it impacts the leasing. But one fact remains, because of the concentration risk, there needs to be diversification efforts. And aviation sector is seen and proven to be the growth sector so far, and we should be promoting it. The other portion on substance, as I mentioned, this is going to be a rule across the board throughout the globe. It's not going to be just confined to Malaysia. You have seen the changes made in Singapore, in Hong Kong. It's also going to be seen in all the IBFCs around the world. So it's going to be a norm rather than an exception. Incentives are supposed to be used rightfully at the time given. So it should be seen as a development driver rather than perpetual. So make use of the incentives, whatever incentives that is provided for by Labuan IBFC, because who knows, going forward in 10 years' time or 15 years' time, there'll be a review whether such incentives and the form that it takes is actually merits the market development or market growth that has been seen over the years. If it doesn't, there could be a case for review. And as mentioned, Labuan leasing remains as a fast-growing sector. However, with all the dynamics within the global market in the international standards, we need to go beyond paper structures. The substance requirement especially is going to be a norm that is going to need to be complied with if you were to will be given a tax incentive, and it's going to be the same for any markets around the world. So we need to go beyond the paper structures alone. And last but not least, by doing all this, we will be supporting Labuan Island's economic pursuit. So be with us on that. Before I end and pass on to my colleague Ernie to go on the more micro and more, I presume, sexy and exciting part of the briefing, and all of you are looking forward to, let me just end with one quote from an Indian author, Sachin Kumar. We need to adapt and evolve, because holding on stagnates our opportunity of becoming better. So I urge to the market and players, do embrace these changes and weather them well. be together with us to evolve Labuan IBFC so that it can scale to greater heights and to become, in fact, a business center of choice, not just for ASEAN market and perhaps even Asia. Thank you.